Is live. Can you hear me? Isn't this fun? Okay, can you hear me? Okay. The other one and not this one? This is just plain test, not test 4. You can hear me. It's success. Thank you, John. I shall now go into content. Have a good evening. No, that's cool. I'll talk to you later. There. Technical difficulties are due to the fact that liberal arts majors are trying to figure this stuff out, and we don't necessarily have all the technique or technicalities down. Anyways, I'm Mark Small. This is Civil Discourse Now. It's been a long day. I know it's not professional for me to sit on camera and eat. And I would just call the tech guy. I just got off the phone with the tech guy who was giving me sound and sage advice. And then in the course of giving me sound and sage advice, screwed up his equipment. But that's how things happen sometimes. And I know it's not professional to eat on the air unless one has a show on cuisine. So this is the cuisine segment of Civil Discourse Now. This is spaghetti. It is non-gluten spaghetti. I fried the burger so that there was a lot less fat on it and ran water over it. Then put the spaghetti and the spaghetti sauce, which is like really healthy, like low cal, I guess, spaghetti sauce together, and put some seasoning in, Italian seasoning, which is kind of like a generic thing of a whole bunch of seasonings that people generally infer would be Italian, I guess. And that is how I got spaghetti this evening. So this is March 10th, 2021. Donald Trump is no longer president of the United States, but for some reason believes that he is. When you see his emails and blogs and everything, or his Twitter feed, well, he's not on Twitter anymore. Wherever it is that he's sending those things out, it says, you know, Donald J. Trump, 45th President of the United States, former President of the United States, because that makes it sound like he's still president. And he never really acted presidential, and he really did a really lousy job as president. If you disagree with me on that, you can call in at 317-517-2037. Oh, wait a minute, I point that way. The camera does opposite. Okay, so that's the number right there, 317-517-2037. There you go. Call in and tell me how silly I'm being. What was disturbing to me today was I was driving in East Central Indiana, and when did presidential campaigns start using flags with candidates' names on them? I don't recall that having been done before. You might look upon it as being creative. I look upon it as being somewhat authoritarian. So I saw several Trump-Pence flags between Interstate 74 and Brookville. I saw several Trump-Pence signs. I saw a couple of signs with Trump's name and no mention of Pence. I saw a couple of signs with Trump's name and guns, figures of guns on there. The most disturbing thing, though, that I saw, and the thing that seems most emblematic of this whole saga of United States history, was, okay, I'm going to say Confederate flag, and people are going to say, well, that's not a Confederate flag. That's a battle flag of the Army in Northern Virginia. Yeah, and they were in the Confederacy. So it was the stars and bars flying out on someone's porch in the town, appropriately enough, of Andersonville. That was a famous prison camp during the Civil War. It was not a declared war. It was an action taken by the federal government against states that committed treason and tried to secede from the Union. And they lost. And so did a lot of causes at that point, like the main cause, that was the cause for slavery. But obviously there are people in the state of Indiana who still embrace the Confederate cause. Now, realize, of course, that the Confederate cause was not an inclusive cause by any means. I mean, first of all, there were 9 million people who lived in the states that would eventually secede from the Union. About 4 million of those people were held in slavery. So that means almost half the people really weren't in favor of the Civil War to begin with. And don't say, you don't know that about those slaves. Nobody asked those slaves. Those slaves, they might have liked that a whole bunch. Better off than where they came from. Well, see, a lot of those slaves, their families had been here for a lot longer than the people who claimed ownership over them. One. Two, I don't care what you say about slavery. It's wrong. It's evil. And those people, if they'd been told what the alternatives were, if they knew anything else, they wouldn't have wanted slavery if they weren't already opposed to it. So that's crap. So states like one state, South Carolina, slaves outnumbered white people. Now, of course, one group of people that isn't kind of figured into the equation, those people whose ancestors were born here long before Europeans arrived. So, today we try to be enlightened and call them indigenous peoples. It means that they were here. Or some people will try to call them by individual tribal names, because there are a lot of different tribes. And some of the tribes were members of confederations that allied themselves for trade and military purposes long before Europeans were even here. But Europeans called them Indians because Europeans thought, mistakenly, as Christopher Columbus thought, that Christopher Columbus thought he'd arrived in or near India. It's not like the Earth being round was some kind of novel concept. Aristarchus of Samos had not only established that the Earth was round, it's about 700 or 800 before Common Era, he actually had calculated the circumference of the Earth to within 20 or 30 miles, something pretty incredible. He did that because he knew that precisely at noon on a specific day of the year, the sun shone directly down a well in a specific town. And so he paced off the distance from the well in that town to like 15 miles, hour miles. I don't know the exact distance that he measured off. But he reasoned that if the Earth were such a size, what the degrees would represent on the distance that he walked. He was able to do that. And so that's an example of somebody who kind of knew that the Earth was round, how big it was, long before Christopher Columbus sailed to come over to what he thought was India. And so he knew basically how far he'd sailed. And he could have thought, I'm only about 15,000 miles short of India, or whatever the exact distance would have been. And he would have said, wow, these people aren't Indians. I might want to ask them what their people are called. They're Arawaks? Anyways, I might ask them what they're called. Instead, he just wanted to find out where the gold was. Where's gold? They were looking for gold every place. Unfortunately, there wasn't a whole lot of gold where they landed. And even then, if you think about all the gold that the Spanish and the Portuguese took over the course of a couple hundred years from the peoples in what is today Mexico and Central America and the northern part of South America, named after Americus Vespucci. That's where we got America. He was a map maker, and his name was on the corner of the map. Fans of Firesign Theater would know it's actually Vespucci land instead of America. They took all that gold total. This was about 15 years ago. I read an article in National Geographic that said the total amount of gold that human beings have discovered in all of time would only be sufficient to fill two Olympic-sized swimming pools. So think about that much gold, and then think about where it went. Because you'd think that with making that much money, that much wealth, because that's what gold represented, was gold, they'd have stuff to show for it. But they didn't. It just went away. They could have built, here's a good term, infrastructure. They could have built, they knew how to do certain aspects of plumbing, like they could have run sewer lines. I mean, they would have been kind of primitive by our standards, but they would have been a way to take waste that causes disease away from population centers. They could have built more modern roadways. They could have built universities. They could have done a lot of things. Instead, they enslaved people whom they didn't kill. They took their land, they took their gold, and then that was about it. They didn't have very much to show for it. So we advanced things a little bit. When the South seceded from the Union, of 9 million people there, 5 million people were white. Not everybody was in favor of secession, and not everybody favored slavery. In fact, only about half of the households in the South of white people who were free claimed ownership over one or more slaves. A really large percentage of the slaves were held on large corporate operations, tobacco farms, cotton farms, plantations, hundreds of slaves. And they were cheap labor. And that's part of what our country was built upon, was slave labor. Also, part of what our country was built upon, as far as what made America great, was committing genocide against the people who lived here, the indigenous peoples. Some enterprising people gave them blankets that were from smallpox patients. The indigenous peoples here were really, 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 they're really subject to smallpox. They're really vulnerable to it. It was very, very deadly to them. They had no resistance to it. So giving them those blankets was means by which they could kill a lot of the indigenous peoples and then take their land. That was kind of an aim of the early days of the United States government. So you look at what we're built upon, what this country started as. We started as a republic controlled by white male landowners. They owned slaves. They were taking land away from the indigenous peoples, and they were doing it to line their own pockets. The early purchases by members of the government were really, really cheap insider trader land deals. Washington and Jefferson in particular bought huge tracts of land for pennies an acre. That would be illegal today because it's really wrong to do that, to use your inside position in government to make profit. I wonder who's done that lately. But anyways, the early days of our country, we built things that way. And see, if we don't recognize that, we continue to suffer from the evil that was done back then. Think about the economic impact of the Civil War. Not only were nearly 700,000 people killed in battle, but a whole bunch of the country was destroyed. And the largest single concentration of capital value in the United States of anything other than land was people held in slavery. And there were a few states north of the Mason-Dixon line that had slavery, but later didn't. But most of those people, most of that wealth was in the South. So at the end of the Civil War, not only had so many battles been fought in the South and so many people died, but nearly half the population was given liberty, and that represented a loss of capital investment, property, whatever you want to say about it, of people in the South. Now, it's evil. That institution was evil. But that's kind of why white people in the South were really, really angry, because they'd been benefiting from these people being slaves for all these generations, and they viewed themselves as being superior to the slaves. It was against the law in some states to teach slaves how to read and write. And then the same people who made it against the law to teach them how to read and write would talk about how stupid slaves were, for example, because they didn't know how to read and write. But then once the Civil War was over, how can you expect people to effectively participate in an economy when they have no marketable job skills? So there was no real program set up to allow them and to encourage them and to give them the benefits that they needed to participate in an economy that enslaved them and their ancestors for generations. So the closest they could come was offering them 40 acres and a mule. That was what was supposed to be given to each former slave. It wasn't. But they weren't even given equal educational opportunities. And you can say, well, they could pull themselves up by their bootstraps. About the time that they tried to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, they'd have people trying to hang them, burn their schools, burn their churches. The people down there didn't really want them to learn or compete or anything. They didn't want them to be equal. They didn't want them to vote. Now, that's why the Democratic Party had such control over what was called the Solid South. From the end of the Civil War until about late 60s, the Democratic Party could count on those states as giving them electors' votes and also control of all the houses, of all the seats in Congress out of that region, most of them, because they were Democratic. People down there hated Republicans because Republicans had pushed for abolition of slavery and then pushed for Reconstruction that would recognize, in part of Reconstruction, recognize the rights of former slaves. And there was a deal cut over the 1876 election. So Rutherford B. Hayes became president of the United States, in return for which the Republicans agreed not to press Reconstruction anymore. So from about that time until the 1964 election, the Solid South was the Solid South for the Democratic Party. And that was like something you couldn't get around. Both parties had conservative wings and liberal wings. But the people who were former slaves and then their descendants had no equal rights and no equal opportunity. Even after Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, they didn't. So anyways, I've been talking a lot. Nobody's been calling in. I'll be back here tomorrow. My name's Mark Small. This is Civil Discourse Now. I'm just got this tech working this evening again. So isn't this fun, being able now to talk and have the audio heard? And the tech guy was coming in, I'd say Johnny on the spot, and that would be pretty close to accurate. Have a marvelous evening. I'm going to finish up this spaghetti. And remember, Vladimir Putin, if you're listening, Yabat Tebya. And remember, if you have your decoder rings, some of you have them already. And these are very, very important. You can figure out a lot about the deep state and also about Antifa. Talk to you tomorrow.